Shalom, and welcome to V'ahavta Yisrael, a Hebrew phrase which means you shall love Israel. We hope you'll stay with us for the next 30 minutes as our teacher, Dr. Baruch, shares his expository teaching from the Bible. Dr. Baruch is the senior lecturer at the Zera Avraham Institute based in Israel. Although all courses are taught in Hebrew at the Institute, Dr. Baruch is pleased to share this weekly address in English. To find out more about our work in Israel, please visit us on the web at LoveIsrael.org. That's one word, LoveIsrael.org. Now, here's Baruch with today's lesson.
Last week, we began a difficult chapter 15 in the book of Leviticus, and we dealt with discharges that primarily came from men. And now, as I shared with you in this second part of our study in this 15th chapter, women are going to take the focus. And we know that women are uniquely different from men. Despite the deceit, the lies, the falsehoods of society, there is a difference between men and women. And this difference is obvious. And we know that women, not men, have what's known as a customary time of impurity each month, a woman who is in the childbearing years. Now, we need to learn some words. And the first word that I want you to learn is the word nida. This word nida speaks to a woman who is menstruating. Now, there's a second word we need to learn, and we encountered this word last week in regard to a male that has a discharge, and that is the word zav. But we're dealing with females this week, so it would be the term in the feminine, which is zava. What is the difference between a nida and a zava? For the most part, we're dealing with a blood discharge from that particular organ of a woman. And we know that that can happen as it normally does during that monthly time, or what happens when it goes longer than the normal period, or at a different time of the month and a unique time. This can show health problems. And therefore, these things, blood in general, must always be dealt with in a specific way. Blood has great significance. Blood has a message. And therefore, because a woman is issuing forth blood, there are rules. This renders her impure. If it's the customary time, nida. If it's a time beyond that customary time or at a different time, then she's called a zava. And we're going to study why this is important, what the rules are according to the Torah. And let me say before we begin our study that this is most significant in the Jewish community today. There's another phrase that I'm going to say to you in Hebrew. It's called Taharat HaMishpacha. What is that? The purification of the family. And it's interesting, although we call it the purification of the family, who is responsible? The woman. She has great influence in her family. And therefore, it's her keeping these laws that have an impact, a great influence upon her family's spiritual condition, whether that family is going to be blessed by God or whether that family will not be blessed by God. So we have this term, Taharat HaMishpacha, family purity, and it deals with what must be done. And let me simply say that we're going to, for the sake of this study, focus upon what the Bible says. Because today, remember, without a temple, the law cannot be observed in the full measure of the law. And therefore, what we have in Judaism is rabbinical law that is enforced. That's what Orthodox Judaism follows. Well, we're not under Orthodox Judaism. And therefore, for the most part, we're not going to deal with what Orthodox Judaism says in regard to this issue. But be assured, it is highly significant. It impacts that family relationship, especially between the husband and the wife, and that time of intimacy. It's regulated by these laws, but they do not follow the biblical laws. They follow rabbinical laws today that are very different. For example, I shared with you the term nida, a woman who enters into that monthly cycle where she is menstruating. Well, today under Jewish law, there is no nida. Everything is rendered as a zava, which is more strict. The time of separation is longer. What must be done to be brought back into the community is different. So be very much aware that there is a significant difference in how it's observed today under rabbinical law compared to what we read in this passage, where primarily we learn the biblical law in regard to this issue. So with that said, let's begin. Take out your Bible. Look with me to Leviticus chapter 15, and we're going to begin in verse 19. Leviticus chapter 15 and verse 19. And a woman, that there shall be a flow, a discharge. And here it is, a discharge of blood, the Hebrew word dam. So she has a discharge of blood. And it says that it should be a discharge in her flesh. If this is the case, then it says 7 days she shall be a nida. She should be impure or unclean, but it's a different word. Last week, and you've heard this word many times, the word tameh, or the noun tum'ah for impurity, being ceremonially unclean. This is a different word. It's not the word tum'ah, but it's the word nida. And we're talking about an impurity that comes about because of that monthly cycle, that there's blood present. And it says here that she is going to be considered impure in that state of uncleanliness for 7 days. Verse 19, the second part. And all who touch her will be unclean until the evening. So here we see the rule. She's a nida. She is healthy, but there is that discharge from her, a discharge of blood. Anyone should touch her in a very innocuous way. Anyone who touches her, he is going to be unclean, or she, if it's a woman, unclean until evening. Now, notice, nothing else needs to be done. But look now to verse 20. And everywhere she sits upon, so everything she sits upon, in her nida, in that state of impurity, during that monthly time, it is unclean. It becomes impure. It becomes defiled. And it says, and all who shall sit upon it, everyone who sits upon that which she has sat upon, is going to be unclean. And it says, look now to verse 21, and anyone who touches her bed. So anyone who touches her bed, notice, this is where she sleeps. And there's a rule. There is seen a greater significance for her simply being something, coming in contact with something for a short period of time, and the place where she sleeps all night. And therefore, we see a different rule. One who touches her bed, the place that she sleeps in, it says, this time he will wash his clothes and wash in water, meaning wash his body in water, And afterwards, he'll still be unclean after he washes his clothes and washes himself, bathes in water. He's going to be unclean until evening. And again, some would say that this washing in water of his body is an immersion. Verse 22. Now, we're not dealing with her bed in verse 22. We're dealing with something that she should sit upon. Look at verse 22. And everyone who touches any vessel which she has set upon it. So now we're seeing that it's not just simply touching her briefly, but it's sitting upon, not her bed, but any place else that she has set. It says here, in this case, he will also wash his garments and wash in water, again, this immersion, and will be unclean until evening. Now look at verse 23. It says, and if upon the bed he or upon a vessel that he sits upon it and touches it, he will be unclean until evening. Now here, notice, it's talking about the bed, hamishkaf, or upon a vessel. But it says here, if he sits up upon that which she has set upon, and he touches it. So notice, she has set upon this, but he only does what? Well, look again, very important. If upon the bed, he or upon the vessel, meaning like a chair, which she has set upon it, he touches. In this case, he's only touched, and therefore he's unclean to evening. He does not need to wash his clothes or immerse himself in water. But, verse 24, but if a man will lie with her. So now we have a situation that she's in that customary time of impurity, and he lies, this term lies, he has relations with her in intimacy, that sexual relation. Verse 24, and if a man shall lie with her, and it shall be that her impurity, what she is now upon him. And because he lied with her, he touched her, but it's not simply an innocuous touching, but he lied with her sexually. Therefore, the same situation that she's in, he enters into, because it says here, and impure or unclean or defiled, however you translate the word tameh, 7 days. And notice, every bed which he will lie upon it will be unclean. So he becomes, because he lied with her, he becomes in the same category, the same situation of impurity, just like her. That's a different from just laying on the bed that she was in or touching it, different, or sitting in a chair that she sat in. Different rules depending upon the situation. Now look at verse 25. A woman that has a flow that flows, a discharge that is discharging of blood. But notice, there's a change. It is not simply during that normal time of impurity each month, but it says here, Yamim Rabim. What's the implication here? Many days. And we are told by the sages, it means many days beyond the normal amount of time. So if you have a normal menstruation for 5 days, 6 days, now we're talking something that is significantly beyond that. 7 days, 8 days, 10 days. This is what this verse is speaking of. Look again at verse 25. A woman that her flow flows, and it's a flow of blood many days. And then it says, and not the time of her being nida. So it's not the normal time of her menstruation, or that it flows beyond. So she can have something that is a discharge of blood, not any way related to that time, that monthly time. Or it can be beyond, meaning, and I've spoke of that just a moment ago, instead of being the normal 5 or 6 days, it's 8, 9, 10, 12 days. So it's an extension. It doesn't end like it normally ends. It continues on, or at an entirely different time of the month. In either situation, she's changed. She's no longer seen as Nida, but she's seen as Zava. And as I shared with you, today, a woman who has a discharge of blood, whether it's the normal time or beyond the normal time or a different time, they are all are treated as a Zava. And rabbinical law has an entirely different way of handling this. So realize that in regard to a normal Nida, it's totally different. And we see some other factors. Look now to verse 25. It says here, or, look at this, or that she should flow beyond or above the normal time of her menstruation. All the days of her flow, she is unclean. And she's going to be treated, that's the same law, even though it's a different circumstance. She is going to be treated as the days of her normal nida, her normal menstruation. She is impure. So the way it's handled is the same way according to the Torah, the same way, whether it's the normal time or not. Now, there's going to be a degree of an exception here in a moment that we're going to deal with. But here, so far, it simply says, as the days of her normal menstruation, so is she. She's impure, and one should treat her in that way, meaning all those laws that we've dealt with from verses 19 through verse 25, they apply to her in any of these three categories. And what are the three categories? The normal time, beyond the normal time, or a totally different time, not at all associated with the normal time. Verse 26. And every bed which she shall lie upon all the days of her flow, we see it's just like the bed of her normal menstruation. It will be to her. So it just reminds us it's the same law for the bed that she lied upon. Same thing in every vessel. And vessel here is probably referring to a bench, a chair, somewhere that she can sit. It says, in every vessel which she sits upon it, it will be unclean. It's as the impurity, the uncleanliness, the defilement of her as a nida, so no change. Verse 27. And everyone that touches them, whatever these things are, if they touch it, they will be impure. But notice, if they touch it in this case, there's a difference. If they touch it, it says here that they will wash, this one will wash his clothes, and he will wash in water, meaning he will immerse. And he's unclean until evening. So here it's somewhat stricter because he doesn't have to sit upon it. He doesn't have to lay upon the same bed. If he touches it in this different category of zava, it's a more stringent. He must always, just for touching, he must always wash his clothes and immerse. Verse 28. Now in verse 28, it's dealing with her being pure. What is that telling us? One simple thing. The blood has stopped. There's no longer any blood whatsoever. This discharge is no longer happening. This is what it means when it says in verse 28. And if she is purified from her discharge, here's a difference. Normally, what happens is this. In the normal state of being a nida in that customary time, so that same monthly cycle, she enters into it. We find that under the Torah law, rabbinical law is different. Remember what I said. Rabbinical law today, everyone is a zava. It's treated this way. But in the Bible, there was a distinction in how a woman was treated, whether she was nida in her customary time or having a discharge of blood beyond that time or at a totally different time. Now, for what we're studying currently, we're dealing with not a nida, the customary time, but a zava, which is beyond. Something's happening that is unusual. It's beyond the normal time or at a different time. And in this case, when it stops, there's no longer any blood. What is she should do? What is she supposed to do? Look at verse 28. If she is purified from her discharge, meaning it's no longer there, it says she counts 7 days. Afterwards, she purifies. Now, the commentators say this. She counts a full 7 days of spotlessness, meaning she has to count, even going beyond, examines herself in a very specific way. We'll set that aside for our discussion. She makes sure that there's no blood whatsoever that is emitting from her. She has to make sure for 7 days. At the end of those 7 days, she is certified as pure. And it says here, ve'achar tithar. And afterwards, she purifies. The rabbinical world sees this purification as her immersing. Now, does she have to immerse according to the Torah after her normal, customary time? What I've said is a nida. The answer is no. Do they today? Today, everyone is treated, every female, if she has a discharge of blood, she's treated as a zava. This is the important thing to know. Therefore, after her monthly time, that discharge ceases. Biblically, it's over. But today, there is 7 days, spotless days, that must be counted in both circumstances. And then she immerses, and then she is brought back into the status of normal. But during the time of the temple or the tabernacle before that, notice what was happening. Look at verse 29. After she completed those 7 spotless days and immersed, it says on the 8th day, she takes for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and she brings them to the priests at the door of the tent of the meeting. So she does that, and notice what it says. The priests will make one of them for a sin offering. Now, has she done some sin? No. But what has happened? The blood, if it's the normal time of nida, that egg has not been fertilized. That egg has not produced life. There's an element of death. And the teaching is, if there's a different time or an extension of that time, there's also a relationship between death, because life is in the blood. If it's out there, it must be dealt with. And that's why there is a sin offering. It's not saying she's guilty, but all of these things are an outcome of sin. What I mean by that is they point to the fact that we're not in the original state that God created us to be in. Sin changed that. And this is an outcome of sin. And therefore, not a sinful act, but that first sinful act in the Garden of Eden. Sin entered into the world, and therefore there is that one of the turtle doves or one of the pigeons for a sin offering, and the other one for a burnt offering, as we've seen at other times. And therefore it says the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord. Why? Because of this flow, this discharge she had that rendered her impure. So we see today, without an active priesthood, without a temple or a tabernacle, no altar, there is no sacrifice that's given. Nothing that's brought to the priests. She simply immerses, and that's the end of it. Now, here again, there is debate whether that phrase, go back to the end of verse 28, where it says, Ve'achar tithar, whether that means to immerse or not. Some will say afterwards, just completing that time, she is pure. That she, just because of the time that passed where there is no evidence of blood, she is now pure. Most of authorities in Judaism says she must immerse. Move on to the next verse, verse 31. Now, this verse begins with a unique word. It's the same word for a crown or a diadem that would set upon a king's head, or a special head covering for the high priest. And what we're talking about, something that sanctifies one, sets this one apart. And this is, again, a big deal within the Bible, that things are set apart for a purpose. And here it relates to all the children of Israel, all of God's people, where it says, look again at verse 31, Ve'hizartem et bnei Israel, and you shall set apart. No other nation does this, no other people. So you're sanctifying, you're setting apart the children of Israel. Why? That they would be separated from their impurity. Now, why is that important? Well, I hope you know the answer to that. If someone is tameh, God's not going to bless. One must be tahar, or tahor would be the correct way, pure, in order that God will work in that one's life. So God wants to set apart the children of Israel in order that he blesses them, and this blessing, this uniqueness that comes upon them is going to be for a witness, that they can see, the nation sees that God makes a distinction, and the implication is that nations would want to join with Israel to become part of a blessed people. That's what happened in Egypt when God made a distinction between the Egyptians and the children of Israel. More and more Egyptians and those from other nations that were there joined with the Jewish people in keeping the Passover. Look again at verse 31. And you shall separate the children of Israel from their impurity, that they should not die in their impurity, when in their impurity that they would do something. If they're impure, therefore they would contaminate, and then we have the word, my tabernacle, my mishkan. Now, there's a change in words, because if you go back up to an earlier verse where it says, look at the end of verse 29, where it says, El patak ohel moed, to the door or the entrance of the tent of meeting, ohel moed. That's the tent of the meeting. It can be translated tabernacle, but here we have the word mishkani, my tabernacle. It's a different word, not the word ohel, tent, the tent of meeting, ohel moed, but mishkan, which comes from the Hebrew word which means to dwell, to reside. So this word, so say the authorities, is more closely related to the dwelling presence of God among his people. And he says that you will not contaminate my tabernacle which is in your midst. Now here, what's the reference? Being in the state of tameh, impure, unclean, defiled, you can't worship God. If you try to, it is going to render impure God's dwelling place. Therefore, what God says is, I want you to be separate, different. Apply these laws to your life so that you can worship me. So another aspect of being tameh is that it impacts your ability to worship God. Well, look at the next verse, verse 32. This is the law of the one that has a discharge. Or, not just the one that has a discharge of blood, that's what we've been talking about, or should go forth from him. So now we're talking about men. And what goes forth? Semen that can make impure this situation, whether the tabernacle, whatever. It deals with impurity, this discharge of that fluid. So again, we're dealing with both, whether it's a discharge of blood or of semen, whatever it is. This is how it must be handled. And this is true, it says here, in order that there's not a contamination of the tabernacle. Last verse, and we'll be done. We have another word that is introduced, this word, dava. Dava usually is referred to a woman who is ill, but ill in a specific way. She has that discharge. So this is true for a woman that's having a discharge of whatever type it might be that renders her impure. And it's also for one that has a discharge of some discharge. And notice it says whether it be for a male or a female. So these are the laws for both male and female that should have a discharge from their body. And it's also for a man, these laws, that will lie with her in her state of being impure. So what we've seen in chapter 15, an entire chapter dedicated to this issue. And again, I realize that it's not pleasant talking about these things, but again, it's the Word of God. And therefore, we want to be disciplined. We want to study all of God's Word and learn these principles because they can be applied to other areas in our life. For example, are there other things that can render us impure, that can contaminate us spiritually? Absolutely. What goes into our bodies through our eyes or through our ears, those things that we see and hear. When we look at things, we ought not see something that is not edifying, but quite the contrary, that which is contaminating from a spiritual standpoint. That can impact our family. That can impact our worship. It can impact God's willingness to work in our life to bless us. So these things have a lot of application towards them. And that's why it's important to learn from them. Well, I'll close with that. Until next time, and by the way, next week we begin chapter 16, and that entire chapter is about one day, and that is Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonement, literally the Day of Atonement. We'll talk more about that term and that day's significance next week when we meet together for Midnight from Jerusalem. Until then, Shalom from Israel.
Well, we hope you will benefit from today's message and share it with others. Please plan to join us each week at this time and on this channel for our broadcast of LoveIsrael.org. Again, to find out more about us, please visit our website, LoveIsrael.org. There you will find articles and numerous other lectures by Baruch. These teachings are in video form. You may download them or watch them in streaming video. Until next week, may the Lord bless you in our Messiah Yeshua, that is Jesus, as you walk with Him. Shalom from Israel.